3 heavy kicks landed like hammers on the man curled on the wet concrete, the sound of leather soles cracking against bone echoing down the service alley, and the sharp metallic stink of blood mixing with sour trash rising hard enough to choke. "Touch him again, and you'll find out what happens." The voice cut through the violence without shouting, calm in a way that made 3 men freeze mid-stomp and snap their heads toward the mouth of the alley, where a skinny young woman stood half in shadow and half in streetlight, her thrift store coat too thin for a Chicago night, her hands trembling only once before they steadied, delivery bag strap digging into her shoulder like she'd been carrying the whole city for years. Brooke Ashford was 27, exhausted from a laundromat graveyard shift and a last run of food deliveries, broke enough to count quarters, desperate enough to keep her mother's hospital bills folded in her pocket, and still she didn't back up when the biggest of them laughed and took a few lazy steps closer, grinning like he could crush her with one hand. "Go home, sweetheart," he said, dragging the word like a knife. "You don't want to end up next to this idiot." He drove another kick into the man's ribs, and the man's teeth clacked against the pavement with a sound that made even the alley seem to flinch. The victim wasn't some nobody who'd wandered into the wrong street. It was Declan Voss, the kind of name people didn't say out loud in this city, a ruthless boss with money, muscle, and a velvet front that kept the cops and the suits smiling while his enemies disappeared. But in this alley, wealth didn't talk, power didn't bargain. There was only ragged breathing, a gunmetal silence, and 12 shadows closing in, because this wasn't a mugging, it was an execution. Brooke's fingers brushed the old Zippo in her coat pocket, the last thing her father left her, and she made a choice that didn't feel like bravery so much as survival, because if she turned away tonight, she'd never sleep again. She shifted her weight, scanned the dim security light, the puddles, the stacked crates, the angle of the fire door, and the men who thought fear always won. Then she stepped forward half a pace and raised her chin. "Last warning," she said, voice low and steady. "Walk away." When their laughter grew louder, she reached behind her without looking, grabbed the nearest weapon the alley offered, and moved like someone who'd learned the hard way that thinking fast can be deadlier than any gun. If you're into stories with danger, slow burn tension, and the kind of twists that hit you in the chest, please hit like. Share this with someone who loves mafia drama with real stakes. And don't forget to subscribe so you won't miss what happens next. Because the moment Brooke makes her move, Declan Voss doesn't just survive, he remembers her, and the city's darkest people start hunting the wrong woman. Brooke clenched her fingers around what she'd just grabbed without looking, the cold, hard feel of metal and splintered wood pressing into her palm, telling her it was a broken door, bolt torn from a shipping crate nearby, heavy enough to stun but not long enough to kill. And it was exactly that fragile balance that made her choose it over anything that could turn her into a murderer in the eyes of the law. She shifted left by exactly half a step, letting the faint security light graze her face just enough to pull their focus onto her. And then, the moment the biggest one laughed and threw his weight onto his front foot, she hurled the delivery bag the other way. It slammed into a stack of plastic bins with a sharp, booming crash that yanked the other 2 men's eyes off her for a single heartbeat. And Brooke used that opening like someone who'd spent her whole life living on moments that lasted no longer than a pulse. She swung the broken bolt in a low arc, not at his head but at the wrist holding the gun. The dry crack of metal meeting bone rang out. The gun clattered onto the wet concrete with a harsh clang, and before he could even spit out a curse, Brooke had kicked it into a puddle and shoved it hard with the toe of her shoe, sending it skidding toward the dark corner where a storm drain gaped open like a trap. The second man rushed her, and Brooke didn't wait for him to get his hands on her. She turned, drove her elbow into his chest to kill his momentum, and at the same time shoved her shoulder in, forcing him back 1 step into a stack of soft cardboard boxes. They collapsed like dominoes, paper tearing and bottles knocking together with sharp, popping snaps in the cold air, and the alley that had smelled only of blood suddenly filled with sound like a small riot. In that split second, she looked back at Declan, the man who was still breathing in broken, uneven pulls as if every inhale were a painful bargain with his own body. And she saw his eyes open, not wide with ordinary panic, but calm and cold, like someone who'd grown used to death standing right behind his neck. "Get up," Brooke said fast, not in the voice of power, but in the voice of someone who knew that 1 more second would end everything right there. And she reached in, grabbed the front of his coat, and hauled him up with all the strength of a woman who'd spent night shifts lifting heavy detergent sacks and dragging loaded carts. Declan was heavier than she'd expected, not because of his size, but because of the weight of blood leaving him. yet he still moved with a frightening kind of cooperation, bracing his shoulders, pushing through his legs, rising like a man who wouldn't allow himself to fall in front of an enemy. And that reflex told Brooke he wasn't the victim of a random scuffle. He was the eye of the storm. She flicked her gaze toward the side emergency exit, where the faded red sign looked like it was about to peel off. Then she snatched the metal lid off a trash can and threw it down hard. The clang echoed back like an alarm bell, enough to make those men flinch, and enough to make the farther shadows in the alley think someone else was coming. She yanked Declan toward the door, their feet slipping on water, her shoulder slamming the cold brick wall, and just as they reached it, a man stepped out from deeper in the darkness, not one of the first three, but one of those other shadows. The lower half of his face wrapped in a cloth, his eyes bright like an animal's. He raised a gun, and Brooke felt her heart drop for one beat. But she didn't stop. She just shoved her hand into her jacket pocket on instinct, found the old Zippo her father had left her, and flipped it open with her thumb. The tiny click vanished under the chaos, but the brief flame flared long enough to throw a reflection into the gunman's eyes, a bright flash that made him squint on reflex. And Brooke threw the Zippo straight at him like she was tossing a scrap of a shooting star, not to burn him, but to steal his attention. And then she drove her foot into the emergency door. It didn't open at first, as if the building itself hesitated to let them in. Brooke leaned in with her shoulder and shoved again, the hinges whining, finally giving way just as a gunshot cracked through the air, the bullet slamming into the metal frame behind them and spitting sparks. Brooke dragged Declan down and into the stairwell. The door slammed shut, and in the pitch black of the emergency stairs, she heard feet scattering outside, curses, radio chatter, like a pack of hunting dogs whose leash had just snapped. The assassins were split, part of them jammed at the mouth of the alley because of the noise and the light, part of them charging the direction Brooke had thrown the bag, part of them pressing up on the emergency door, and Brooke knew she'd bought time, but it was cheap time, the kind that could run out at any moment. She panted, her back against the cold wall, reached for her jacket pocket, and realized the Zippo was gone, her chest tightening as if someone had ripped a piece of memory out of her. But before she could mourn it, she felt a gaze settle on her. Declan stood one step above her, one hand clamped to his ribs, the other gripping the railing, and his eyes weren't grateful, and they weren't afraid. They were the measuring look of a predator who'd just seen another creature do something no one expected. He tilted his head, listening to the footsteps beyond the door, then looked back at Brooke, as if locking a conclusion into place, that she hadn't shown up by accident, that the way she chose her targets, the way she avoided killing, the way she used sound and light and psychology to break the rhythm of an execution, all of it pointed to one cold truth. She'd lived inside violence long enough to learn its laws, and just as Brooke was about to speak, she heard metal scrape hard against the door below, like claws hunting for the latch, and she understood the game hadn't truly begun. It had only changed arenas. Brooke didn't give herself permission to panic. She just listened so hard she could tell which pair of shoes stopped in front of the emergency door and which pair ran past the mouth of the alley. Then she grabbed the inside latch and shoved it over hard, the metal catching with a small click that sounded like lightning in the dark stairwell. So she immediately yanked off her jacket, wrapped it around her arm, and wedged it into the latch gap to deaden the rattle if someone kicked the door. Then she pulled Declan up a few more steps, not so high that he'd pass out from blood loss, but far enough that if the door burst open, the first shadow charging in wouldn't see them right away. The stairwell lights were the cheap motion sensor kind, flickering like a weak heart. And Brooke understood the light in here wasn't a savior. It was a beacon. She reached up to the small electrical box mounted on the wall and snapped the main switch down in one decisive motion, like she'd done this many times in her life. Darkness dropped in, thick and cold, but at least the hunters would lose their visual edge, and she was used to moving through night. She signaled Declan to stay quiet without words, just pressed one finger to her own lips, then set her other palm against his chest to feel his breathing, shallow and quick, as if his rib cage were trying to hold on to a life-or-death secret. Blood soaked through his shirt, hot at first and then slowly turning cold. Brooke lowered him onto the steps, his back against the wall, his head angled slightly so he wouldn't choke. Then she rummaged through the delivery bag she'd thrown in a rush and found paper napkins, salt packets, a bottle of water, and the most important thing, a roll of cloth tape she always carried, because the laundromat always had something that needed a quick patch. She didn't have time to make it pretty. She only needed Declan not to drop right here. So she tore her old t-shirt into strips, stuffed the napkins in as padding, pressed hard over the wound that kept seeping, then wrapped the cloth tape around his torso, tightening just enough to slow the bleeding without stealing his breath, all of it done in silence like a ritual. Declan didn't groan. There was only one sharp inhale that died in the back of his throat. His eyes cracked open, dark and alert, watching her the way someone watches a technical procedure. Not kindness, and Brooke saw his hand drift on instinct toward where a weapon should be, even though he had nothing left in his grip, except pain. Outside the door below, the scrape of metal came again, this time with a hiss of whispers through a radio, then a heavy thud, like someone testing force. Brooke put her ear to the wall and counted the beats, not for comfort, but to measure how long they'd take before changing tactics. She dragged Declan up 2 more steps, then reached out and wiped the long smear of blood on the floor with her jacket, dragging it from inside to outside to erase their direction, but she couldn't erase it all. A thin red line still clung to the edge of one step like a guiding thread, and her wet shoe prints were still faintly stamped in the stair dust, because she had nothing to clean with that wouldn't make noise. Brooke swallowed hard. The loss of the Zippo flared again like a sting, as if she'd paid with her father's keepsake for a man she still didn't truly know, but she pushed it aside because the footsteps outside had changed rhythm, no longer loud and aggressive but slow, stalking, like they were listening for the sound of their breathing. She leaned in and whispered at Declan's ear, her voice so low it was almost nothing, that if he passed out she wouldn't be able to drag him any farther, and if he still wanted to live, he had to stay awake. Declan blinked once, slow and controlled. Then he lifted his hand and closed it around Brooke's wrist, not hard, but firm enough for her to understand this wasn't a desperate grasp for help. It was the hold of someone who never fully trusted anyone. And in the darkness, his voice was low and cold, steady as metal. And he said one thing that made Brooke's spine feel colder than this stairwell, that she'd done what no one did for free, and from the second she pulled him through that door, her kindness was no longer kindness. It was a mark. And the men outside wouldn't only hunt him, they'd hunt the person who touched him before he died. Brooke kept Declan in the darkness for one more beat, long enough that her ears began to ring from the strain, and then everything outside suddenly changed texture. The stalking footsteps were cut clean by the long wail of sirens, radios overlapping, and blue and red light swept through the crack of the emergency door like a blade moving back and forth. Someone had called it in, or the men out there had pulled back to avoid getting tangled with the police. And whichever it was, Brooke knew her only chance was to leave this place before the door was breached, and they were dragged out like criminals. She listened one more time to make sure the metal scraping was gone. Then she loosened the cloth tape on one side, just enough for Declan to breathe easier without letting the blood surge again. And just as she reached for the latch, Declan stopped her hand, his eyes in the dark, darker than the stairwell itself. No thank you. Only a command he didn't speak. But Brooke understood perfectly. He wasn't going to let the police see him here. He leaned over and opened a side door that led into the building's service corridor, as if he'd spent his whole life slipping through exits like this. Then he disappeared downward, his footsteps impossibly light for someone wounded, leaving Brooke with the cold of the brick wall and his warning still caught in her ear. Brooke stood still for a beat, her heart pounding like it wanted out of her chest. Then she forced herself back into the only role she knew how to wear, a delivery girl who'd wandered into the wrong place, a nobody, someone not worth remembering. She pushed the emergency door open and stepped onto the street in the flashing lights. The whole stretch before the alley was already sealed off with yellow tape, patrol cars parked at angles, an ambulance with its rear doors open, and a city camera mounted on a light pole, aimed at the scene like an eye that never blinked. An officer stopped her immediately, voice sharp, asking where she'd come from, what she was doing here, whether she'd heard the gunshot. Brooke kept her face blank just enough and answered with tiny pieces of truth so she wouldn't have to build a new story, that she'd been on a delivery run, heard noise, saw people running, got scared and backed away, didn't see anyone's face clearly, didn't know anything else. And every sentence she gave was balanced like a tightrope step, harmless enough not to be held, vague enough not to sell out a man she'd just pulled away from death. Another officer came closer, looked at the torn delivery bag and the grime on her hands, his gaze pausing on the small scratches along her wrist as if he were connecting dots. Brooke felt her throat go dry and raw, and right then a female detective appeared, hair pinned into a neat bun, dark coat, her voice calmer but sharp, asking the same questions again. only this time she looked straight into Brooke's eyes like she wanted to see what Brooke was hiding inside her pupils. Brooke forced herself not to blink too fast, answered again, while inside her mind was screaming about the Zippo, because she suddenly realized the only thing her father had left her hadn't been in her pocket since the stairwell, which meant it was somewhere in that alley, which meant it was in a hunter's hand, or on blood-slit concrete. She barely turned her head toward the mouth of the alley when she saw an officer bend down and pick up a small metallic object from a puddle, wipe it roughly with a gloved hand, then lift it under the light. The lighter lid flicked open and shut with a dry little click, and Brooke felt like someone had squeezed her heart in a fist. She stepped forward on reflex, the words spilling out that it was hers, but the detective only tilted her head and asked why her property was sitting inside a scene with blood and bullet marks. Brooke swallowed the true answer, because the true answer would lead them to the stairwell, to the man who'd vanished, and to a sentence she couldn't carry. She lied clumsily, said maybe she'd dropped it when she ran, said she'd panicked, said she didn't know anything else. The detective watched her for so long Brooke thought she might collapse. Then she signaled for someone to keep the object, her voice turning cold as she said it was evidence. They'd file it as seized, and if Brooke wanted it back, she could follow procedure. Brooke stood under the blue and red lights, listening to the scratch of pen on paper, listening to the radios, listening to car doors shutting, and in that moment, she understood she'd lost more than a lighter. She'd lost the last anchor that tied her to her father's memory, and the man she'd saved had vanished from sight as if he'd never existed at all, leaving her alone in the street, small, exposed, and recorded by the city's invisible eyes with every breath she took. Brooke walked away from the blue and red lights, like someone stepping out of a storm who wasn't allowed to shake. She moved on foot through streets that were still wet, the sirens fading behind her, but the feeling of being watched clinging to the back of her neck like a cold hand. And when she reached the old boarding house on the west side, the wooden stairs groaned under her feet like an accusation. The second-floor hallway was darker than usual, because a bulb had burned halfway out. Old cigarette smoke and bleach crowded the air, and at the far end of the corridor, right beside her door, a man stood with his shoulder to the wall as if he'd been waiting a long time, hood up, a paper cup of coffee in his hand, calm in a way that didn't belong here. Brooke slowed, her heart pounding, tried to act like she hadn't noticed, but when she fumbled for her keys, the man lifted his head, his gaze sliding over her face, and then stopping on her wrist, wrapped in makeshift bandage, as if he were reading an invisible line of text. Brooke opened her door fast, slipped inside, threw the lock, then stood with her back against it, listening as footsteps in the hallway stopped for a few seconds right outside her room before moving on, soft as a reminder that they knew she was here. The room was small as a box, just an old spring mattress, a chipped wooden table, and a sink that leaked. But tonight it wasn't shelter anymore. It was only a place where she could hear her fear clearly. Her phone vibrated. An unknown number, Brooke answered, and the other end was silent. No breathing, no voice, only a blank space thick as ice. Then the call ended, and right after that another call came in, this one from the hospital where her mother lay. Brooke picked up. The nurse on the other end sounded tired but professional, reminding her that June Ashford's payment file was past due, and without an additional deposit, some services would be delayed. Not a direct threat, but to Brooke, it landed like a death sentence, because she understood every delay meant her mother's body was being left behind. She stared into her pocket, at the bills she'd folded neatly, as if she could fold desperation into perfect squares, and something tight rose in her throat. Before she could breathe, the phone vibrated again, this time a message from an unsaved number. Only 2 words, pay up, then an address, then another line saying they knew exactly which ward her mother was in. Brooke gripped the phone until her knuckles blanched white, and then there was a knock on her door. Tap, tap. Not rushed, not hard, the kind of knock that said the door would open because they already owned her fear. Brooke looked through the peephole and saw the creditor she'd met behind the laundromat parking lot. A man with a close cut, his collar turned up, cheap cologne, a smile that looked like a greeting but eyes that were cold. "Brooke," he said through the door, his voice syrupy in a fake way. "We need to talk about the money you owe." Brooke didn't open. She only asked what he wanted, and he gave a small laugh, told her she knew exactly what he wanted, that delay didn't make a debt smaller, and that hospitals didn't wait for anyone. When he left, Brooke thought she'd been given one breath of peace, but she heard his steps stop at the end of the hall, heard someone chuckle under their breath, heard a phone being dialed, then a whisper too small to catch. as if the boarding house had suddenly gained people who didn't belong to it. Brooke pulled the curtain aside and looked down at the street, saw a dark-colored car parked far off. No lights, no music, just sitting there like a shadow that understood patience. And in that moment she realized last night's rescue hadn't ended in the alley. It had only opened a new list in someone else's mind. A list with her name on it. Fear wasn't a feeling that came and went anymore. It turned into a schedule, into corners to avoid. Hours when she couldn't come home late, calls she couldn't answer, names she couldn't say. And she sat on the edge of the bed, still holding her phone like it was a bomb, wondering how a poor woman who only knew how to count coins could become the target of people the whole city didn't dare name. Brooke didn't sleep. She just sat with her back against the wall, listening to the building breathe through its water pipes, distant and near footsteps, and small sounds so ordinary they'd usually be ignored, because tonight everything could be a signal. Near dawn, when the sky outside her window turned the dull color of lead, her phone vibrated again. An unknown number. Brooke expected another silent call, but this time there was a voice. A man's voice, low and flat like the surface of winter water, saying her name exactly, without needing to ask. Brooke tightened her grip on the phone and demanded to know who he was. The voice didn't answer directly. It only said she had 2 minutes to come downstairs, and if she didn't, an ambulance would have to come here for a different reason. Brooke shot to her feet, heart pounding. She pressed her ear to the door. The hallway was quiet. Then she cracked the door open and saw the hooded shadow from last night was gone, replaced by a clean emptiness, as if no one had ever stood there. She hurried down the stairs, each wooden step groaning under her feet like a protest. And when she reached the sidewalk, the dark black car was parked right in front like it had belonged there for years, the windows tinted so deeply she couldn't see inside, the engine running soft, like restrained breathing. The rear door opened without a hand touching it, and Brooke stopped, spine straight, both hands clenched into fists inside her pockets, and said she wasn't getting into a stranger's car. "You don't have the right to call anyone a stranger anymore," the man's voice answered from the darkness inside the car. And then Declan Voss stepped out, as if he were stepping out of a room with no light, his dark coat unwrinkled, his face still pale from blood loss, but his eyes sharp and clear, as if he'd never been on wet concrete. He didn't come to apologize, and he didn't come to explain. He came like a man placing a paper on a table and waiting for someone else to sign. And the way he scanned the street, the upstairs windows, the mouth of the alley, made Brooke understand this wasn't a chance meeting. It was a collection of risk. "I can make your creditor vanish from your life before lunch," he said, voice calm, as if he were talking about the weather. "I can make the hospital stop calling you every hour, and I can make anyone watching that room forget this address exists." Brooke gave a dry laugh, not because it was funny, but because she'd seen enough false promises to be allergic to them. She told him she wasn't selling herself, wasn't selling her mother. There wasn't becoming anyone's game. Declan didn't move. He only looked at her like he was looking at someone who still believed morality was armor. And then he said something that made the hair rise on the back of Brooke's neck. "Last night there were 12 men hired to kill me," he said slowly, each word dropping onto the sidewalk like stone. "They didn't fail because they were weak. They failed because you broke the rhythm. And now, if they can't take me fast, they'll take what's easier." Brooke wanted to say she was nobody, but Declan lifted his hand and showed her his phone screen, a blurry image cut from a street camera, the shape of a thin girl in a light coat standing at the mouth of the alley, and even though her face wasn't clear, the delivery bag and the way she stood were too familiar. "They don't need your name to find you," he said. "They only need your habits, your route, your mother's hospital, and the keepsake you dropped." Brooke stopped breathing, the loss of the Zippo stabbing into her chest like a needle, and for one moment she hated Declan for being right. I hated herself for letting everything become predictable. "I'm not offering you a life," Declan continued, his eyes not softening. "I'm offering survival. You'll stay inside my control zone for a short time, until I can close that hunting ring. In return, your mother is protected, and you won't have to guard your door with a chair jammed under it." Brooke bristled, and said she didn't belong to anyone. She laid down her boundaries like stakes driven into dirt, that she wouldn't be a lover, wouldn't be a hostage, wouldn't sign anything that bound her for life. Declan listened like it was something he could accept. Then he stepped a half step closer, close enough for Brooke to catch the faint antiseptic on his coat and the metallic scent of dried blood, and he spoke lower now, no longer an offer but a naked fact. "You can hate me," he said. "You can fear me. But you can't think you'll be safe if you stay here alone. They'll come back. And this time they don't need me, Brooke. They only need you." Brooke got into the car not because she trusted him, but because she'd seen that blurry photo and understood that from this moment on, every decision she made would have a price in blood. The car slid through Chicago streets that were waking up, leaving the boarding house behind, like shedding a thin layer of skin. And when they stopped in front of a dark glass building near the loop, Brooke looked up and saw a sign that wasn't loud but was precise, a short name hanging there like a promise of cleanliness, while the air by the entrance felt heavy with a cold discipline she'd only ever sensed in places where people didn't speak much, because everyone already knew the rules. The door opened, and the scent of polished wood and expensive liquor poured out like a warm curtain that was only pretending. Low amber light. Music so soft it was almost the room's heartbeat, and Brooke stepped inside in old shoes still wet, a thin coat, and a sharp sense of not belonging. But no one looked at her like she was poor. They looked at her like she was a new factor just placed into a meeting room. 2 bodyguards at the entrance didn't ask her name. They only nodded to Declan, their eyes sweeping Brooke fast and thorough, from the makeshift bandage on her wrist to her empty pockets, like they were building a list of risks in their heads. Declan didn't take her through the main guest area. He moved down a side corridor where the lights were dimmer and the music nearly disappeared, to a private room with a thick door and one-way glass. Inside there was a low table, leather chairs, and a middle-aged man in a dark suit already waiting with a thin file folder, the face of someone used to reading fine print and used to saying sentences that made other people sign. Declan sat down like he'd never been hunted, like he'd never lost blood. Only the way his hand rested on his ribs, half a beat slower, gave away the wound. Then he looked at Brooke and motioned for her to sit, and Brooke stayed standing one more second to prove she wasn't an object that could be let in, and sat down. "Full name?" Declan asked, his voice flat, not gentle, not harsh. The voice of a man used to getting answers. Brooke said it clearly. Then he asked for her address, her workplace, her hours, her mother's doctor's name, each question like a thin blade cutting into her life to extract information. Brooke answered what she had to keep her mother alive. But when he asked whether she had anyone close beyond the hospital, she paused, looked him straight in the eyes, and said he didn't have the right to pull her whole life out like a file. The air in the room shifted. The lawyer's hand stilled. The 2 guards by the door didn't move, but Brooke felt they were ready. And Declan only tilted his head, as if he were watching a rare reaction. "You think rights are something I ask permission for," he said. But there was no intoxicated threat in his voice, only a cold fact. Brooke didn't bow. She said she agreed to temporary protection because of her mother, but she wouldn't accept control over her private life. No one touched her mother without her consent. No one followed her into the hospital room, and she wouldn't sign anything that turned her into property. The lawyer placed a stack of papers on the table, spoke about a security agreement, about temporary housing, about how they would cover the hospital costs, about how Brooke wasn't allowed to make careless contact so she wouldn't be tracked. The words smooth as oil, but Brooke looked at them and saw a trap wrapped in polite language. She pushed the papers back, said she would agree only to what served safety. She wouldn't sign any clause about what she owed Declan beyond staying somewhere secure, and if they wanted to protect her, then protect her. Don't buy it with a signature. Declan watched her for a long moment, then asked a question that sounded casual but was really a needle. Why she hadn't run last night, why a woman who had to count every coin had chosen to stand in front of 12 shadows. Brooke answered without poetry that she'd run enough in her life already. Run from the sound of shoes in her own house. Run from the times her mother cried in the kitchen. Run from bills and collection calls, and she didn't want one more run that would haunt her until she died. Declan didn't smile, didn't pity her, but his eyes shifted, as if he'd just identified something money couldn't buy, something that made her different from the people who still knelt in front of him to beg. And in that moment, his posture moved a fraction, from seeing Brooke as a risk that needed hiding, to seeing her as a variable that needed keeping. He tapped the table once, signaling the lawyer to revise the papers to match Brooke's conditions. Then he leaned toward her, his voice still cold but no longer distant, and said she wasn't allowed to gamble with her life like that ever again if she wanted her mother to stay alive. And Brooke answered that she wouldn't take orders like a dog being protected. She would only take truth. And if he wanted her cooperation, he had to tell her what was really happening. Declan looked at Brooke like he was weighing a knife in his hand, then gave the slightest nod, and outside the one-way glass room the music stayed soft as velvet, But Brooke knew she'd just stepped into a world where velvet was only the covering, and underneath it was steel. Declan didn't make Brooke wait long. Maybe because he understood that people like her couldn't endure ambiguity. They lived on truth, even when truth hurt. And when the lawyer left to revise the papers according to the boundaries Brooke had set, Declan stood, led her down another corridor, deeper, quieter, where the paintings weren't there to be beautiful but to mislead. And the final door opened into a dark office that smelled of new wood and old paper, the desk lamp throwing light across his face so the pallor showed harder, as if his body still hadn't caught up to the fact that he'd lived. He didn't sit right away. He shut the door, checked the lock, then turned back to Brooke, his voice low and even, like he was reading a report he hated having to deliver. He said there was a ledger, not an old paper one, but an encrypted book that recorded every stream of money moving through shell companies, shipping contracts, charitable donations, the handshakes between the underworld and men in clean suits. And inside it, there was a section tied to a public land project in Chicago, a piece of property that on paper was meant to serve the community, but in reality was a machine for laundering money, buying influence, and pushing poor people out of neighborhoods with numbers that looked harmless. Brooke listened and felt cold. Because public land wasn't foreign to her, neither were projects that promised change and then turned into buildings she'd never step inside. She just hadn't expected to be hearing the real reason from the mouth of a man who stood on the other side of the law. Declan said that ledger turned everything into a sentence for a lot of people. Not only for him, because he was the exposed shadow, while the clean ones stood behind it. And because of that, if the book was released the wrong way, it wouldn't bring justice. It would bring a purge. The powerful would burn every witness, every neighborhood, every thread to save themselves, and people like Brooke would be the first to die with no headlines written about them. Brooke asked who had taken it, and Declan didn't dodge. He said there was a traitor inside his own circle, someone close enough to know schedules, trusted enough to be allowed to touch things no one was supposed to touch. That person had sold information to a third party, not a street gang, but a network with money and connections. And they hired 12 assassins, not because they wanted a spectacle, but because they wanted it finished fast, clean. Before Declan had time to understand where the knife had been placed in his back, Brooke felt her stomach knot, not out of sympathy for Declan, but because she understood that cold logic. A powerful man dropped in an alley so everything looked like ordinary violence, and the city would swallow it like it had swallowed 1,000 other stories. Declan watched Brooke as if weighing how much truth she could carry. Then he said what made her feel truly trapped, that if the police found the ledger first, they wouldn't protect witnesses. They'd turn witnesses into evidence, drag them into the light, and then toss them back into the dark. Because the system could look clean on paper while inside it still had dirty hands, and those hands didn't want a ledger breaking the order they were profiting from. Brooke thought about the Zippo that had been seized, thought about the way the detective had looked at her, thought about the city camera recording her outline, and she understood that what Declan called a clean system was really just another machine, a machine that used procedure to grind people down, while Declan's machine used fear to control them, and she was caught between the two like a thin sheet of paper. She asked why he was telling her this, why he was pulling her into it when he had an empire and dozens of men to handle it. Declan answered flatly that she was the only variable that night the traitor hadn't accounted for, that she'd saved him and ruined the plan, and now they would come for her to patch the hole, because there was nothing more dangerous than a witness who hadn't been controlled. Brooke wanted to say she didn't want any part of it, but Declan cut her off, his voice lower, sharper, saying she'd been part of it the moment she stood at the mouth of that alley and raised her voice. And if she wanted her mother to live, if she wanted herself to live, she had to understand this game wasn't about choosing to stay outside or step in anymore. It was about choosing who would control the story of her, the hunters, or the man standing in front of her with eyes cold as steel, and a ledger that could set an entire city on fire. The days that followed moved like background music turned down low. No more knocks from the creditor, no more dark car planted under her boarding house window. And that should have let Brooke breathe, but instead she felt like she'd been placed inside a velvet-lined box, warmer, cleaner, safer, and sealed so tight it was hard to breathe. The temporary place Declan arranged wasn't a showy penthouse. It was an empty apartment in a guarded building. Hallways scented with floor cleaner, cameras on every corner, keycard entry, and a doorman who looked at her with no curiosity, only caution, like his job was to make sure she didn't disappear, not to make sure she was free. Her phone was replaced with a new device that held none of her old contacts. Every outgoing call had to go through an intermediary number, and every time she stepped out of the elevator, there was always a shadow walking a few yards behind her. Not close enough to call it tailing, but close enough to remind her that her life now sat inside the control radius of a man who never trusted spontaneity. Her mother at the hospital was transferred to a better specialist. The nurses spoke to Brooke in a different tone, no longer the cold reminders, but the kind of voice that said the payment file had been updated. Everything was being handled. Brooke heard it and wanted to say thank you, but she didn't know who to thank, because the nature of this wasn't a miracle. It was power, pushing a button. Declan didn't come sit beside her the way men did in movies. He wasn't gentle. He didn't comfort her. He didn't say everything would be fine. He only sent short messages saying her mother had dialysis scheduled on time. The doctor had reviewed the lab results. She didn't need to reply. And that cold precision made Brooke feel relieved and furious at once, because it made her feel like she was surviving on a system she didn't control. She tried to keep her boundaries by asking hard questions, tried to claim agency. But every time she asked to go out alone, the answer was always, not now. Every time she wanted to return to the boarding house to collect her things, the answer was, it wasn't safe. And Brooke began to understand that her freedom had been narrowed into a corridor. A prettier corridor, but still a corridor. One evening, as Brooke sat by the window watching the city glow like skin with scars, there came a knock at the door. Not hurried, just 3 even beats like a code. Then one of Declan's men stepped in and said flatly that Declan wanted to see her. Brooke was taken down to the garage and into the back seat of another black car, moving through streets where the streetlights made everything look cleaner than it really was. And when the car stopped at a warehouse near the docks, Brooke smelled iron, oil, and the cold breath of water, a scent that didn't belong to any luxurious lounge. Declan stood in the darkness beneath white fluorescent lights, his coat open, his wound neatly wrapped, his face unchanged. And in front of him was another man being held tight, mouth taped, hands bound, eyes panicked, the eyes of someone who understood there was no road back. Before Brooke could ask, Declan spoke, calm, saying this man had worked for him, had been trusted, but had sold a small piece of information to the wrong people. And in Declan's world, a small piece of information could kill more people than a gun. Brooke watched the man shake his head, trying to speak through the tape, and she looked at Declan, hoping to find a crack, a place for mercy. But Declan didn't give her that. He didn't hit. He didn't shout. He only signaled, and a bodyguard stepped forward, pulled a phone from the man's pocket, opened a thread of messages, and set it on the table like a sentence. Declan bent down and said something very small into the traitor's ear, words Brooke couldn't hear. But she saw the man begin to sob, and then the warehouse door opened behind them. 2 others dragged him away. No screaming, no long struggle, only a cold, empty space left behind, as if he'd never existed. Brooke stood still, her hands cold, Declan's earlier words about the ledger and the purge echoing in her mind. And she understood that violence in this world didn't need noise. It only needed efficiency. Declan turned and looked at her, not asking permission, not offering explanation, as if her witnessing was part of a test, to see whether she'd break, to see whether she'd run. Brooke wanted to scream that she didn't want to see any of it, wanted to say she didn't belong to that kind of darkness, but her throat made no sound, because at the same time her phone vibrated with a message from the hospital saying her mother had been moved to an earlier treatment slot, and Brooke felt herself being pulled in 2 directions, hating Declan for what he was, fearing him for what he could do, and yet unable to deny that right now her mother was living easier because of one nod from him. Declan stepped closer, didn't touch her, only stood near enough for Brooke to feel the chill coming off his coat, and he spoke slowly that she needed to understand one thing. Her safety wasn't free. It was bought by him clearing the threats around her before they could reach her. Brooke looked at him, disgust and gratitude blending into a bitter taste, and for the first time she realized the most dangerous thing wasn't the assassins out there. It was the truth that she was beginning to lean on a man she both hated and feared just to make it to tomorrow. A few days after the warehouse night, Declan didn't say anything more about the man who'd disappeared, and he didn't ask Brooke whether she was sleeping, as if those questions didn't exist in his language. But that morning, the car took Brooke on a different route, not back to the secured apartment or the hospital, but to an old brick building at the edge of a neighborhood Brooke used to pass through as a kid, where stores closed early and playgrounds sat chained shut, as if the whole block had been punished for being poor. The iron gate opened, and inside was a small work site, neat and organized. Workers painting, others installing lights, drills biting into the air, and a new sign still wrapped in plastic that named a community center project, the letters so clean they looked out of place against cracked walls. Declan stepped out of the car in dark clothes with no logo, no speech, no wave. But his presence alone made people straighten their backs by reflex, and Brooke stood beside him, watching how power here didn't need to shout. It only needed to arrive. A woman managing the project laid out plans, class schedules, a training area, a reading corner, job support services, everything that sounded like the good things Brooke had heard 100 times on television and then watched die young. But this time something was different. Because the money wasn't coming from a vague fund. It was coming from a source the whole city feared and respected. And because of that, everything was moving with an unsettling speed. Declan stood in front of the sign and told a group of invited reporters that this was a reinvestment project for the community. That this place would open to kids, to families, to people left behind, and he said it all without emotion, in a cold business voice like he was announcing a deal, and that lack of performance made it harder to argue with. Brooke understood at once this wasn't only charity. It was a soft layer of protection, a safe zone built out of light to cover movements in the dark, and also a quiet form of atonement, the kind of atonement Declan could tolerate. Atonement through action, not apology. She was pulled into operations not because anyone wanted her busy, but because she actually knew how this neighborhood breathed, knew what parents feared, knew what kids needed beyond slogans. And when she stood talking with a young mother about opening hours, about free study space, about childcare, so parents could take extra shifts, Brooke saw people's eyes change, from suspicion to cautious hope, a hope so rare that simply having a promise kept on time could make someone's eyes shine with tears. Children began to hover at the gate, at first only watching, then stepping inside, then laughing when they saw new basketballs, new books, new walls, and Brooke realized it had been a long time since she'd heard laughter in a place that used to hold only sirens and arguments. But at the same time, she felt a different kind of gaze. The gaze of people who smelled money and land the way others smelled blood. During an introduction event that included a few city representatives, a local politician showed up, smile thick, handshake firm, speaking all the right lines about community and future, but his eyes didn't go to the children. They went to the site drawings, the lot boundaries, the places where expansion could happen, like he was calculating every square foot. He praised Declan just loudly enough for the cameras to catch, then turned to Brooke and asked who she was. Asked how she was connected to this area, the tone friendly, but the questions aimed precisely at points that could become a file, and Brooke felt her skin turn cold, because she remembered what Declan had said about public land projects and clean people with dirt inside them. Declan stood beside her and didn't step in. He only watched Brooke's reaction like another test, and Brooke answered briefly, said she was only helping with operations. She'd lived near here before. She wanted kids to have somewhere safe, nothing more, nothing less, giving him nothing he could hold. The politician smiled, a smile that never reached his eyes. Then he left. But Brooke knew he wouldn't forget her face, because people like that didn't forget any piece they might be able to use. That same afternoon, while Brooke was taping class schedules onto the bulletin board, a younger man appeared in a light-colored shirt, a volunteer badge clipped on neatly, a pleasant smile, introducing himself by saying he'd heard this place needed someone to teach skills and help with job paperwork, that he had experience working with the community, that he only wanted to help. Every word was right, too right, right in a way that made Brooke uneasy, like something had just been placed into an empty slot without anyone asking who brought it. He said he knew Brooke's name, said he'd seen her mentioned in a local organizing group, and Brooke watched the way his eyes scanned the space, the way they flicked over the cameras, the emergency exit, the staff schedule, and she felt a small thorn sink into her instincts, that this volunteer had arrived too perfectly, too on time, like a piece designed to slip into the picture. Brooke turned to look at Declan, and for the first time, she saw him not watching the center, not watching the reporters, not watching the politician who'd just left, but looking straight at the volunteer, his gaze cold and still, as if he'd realized, too, that beneath the soft velvet of this good thing, a thread of a different color had just started to be woven in. Trust in this neighborhood was like a flame trying to rise from a wet match. It could flare and die in the same breath, and Brooke knew that. So she held everything tight the way you hold your own breathing, Every first session had to start on time, keep its promise, keep its sense of safety, so parents could loosen their grip on fear for just a moment. That afternoon, the kids' basketball class had been running for only 15 minutes. The steady thump of the ball on the freshly cleaned floor, small laughs rolling over brick walls like a kind of light this building had forgotten. Then the ceiling lights flickered once, twice, and went out. It wasn't a normal outage, because the whole block outside the windows still glowed, only this building had been swallowed by darkness. And right after that, the backup generator that should have kicked in fell silent too, as if someone had put a hand around its throat. In the dark there was a small child's scream, then chair legs scraping, messy footsteps, and Brooke felt that moment like a trap being opened, because in places that had carried violence, darkness wasn't only darkness, it was memory. She didn't shout, she didn't run in circles. She stepped into the center of the room with a calm so cold it surprised even her. Her voice thick and steady, telling everyone to stay still, telling the kids to hold hands, telling the parents to gather their children close to the wall. And as she spoke, she turned on her phone flashlight, aiming the beam at the floor so it wouldn't blind anyone, only making a small line of sight so people wouldn't panic. An employee ran in saying there was a burning smell in the equipment room. Brooke didn't let anyone rush in. She split tasks like she was moving troops. One person guiding the kids out the main door in a line, one person opening the side door to vent air, one person calling the fire department. And she herself went back into the hallway, moving fast but without sounding rushed. Because in her head, panic was exactly what a saboteur wanted. The equipment room door was cracked, thin smoke drifting out, not thick enough to kill, but thick enough to make people imagine the worst. And when Brooke saw the electrical panel had been pried open, wires cut clean, the way someone cuts what they already understand, she knew this wasn't an accident. It was a message. Outside, parents had clustered, cars stopped in the street, a few people started filming, and rumors spread faster than smoke. That the center wasn't safe, that someone was hurt, that this was only a publicity stunt by a crime boss, that anyone who brought their child here was inviting trouble. Brooke stood at the entrance, kept her voice calm, explained that everyone had gotten out safely, that no one was injured, that the fire department was on the way, but she saw in the parents' eyes something words couldn't reach, the fear of being dragged right back to the place they'd just tried to step out of. Declan appeared after that, not loudly, but his presence made the air thicken like metal. His gaze swept over the pried door, the cut wires, then stopped on a bodyguard holding a strange man who'd been grabbed near the back exit. The man's face pale, his hands shaking, his mouth stuttering that he'd only been walking by, that he hadn't done anything. Declan didn't ask questions. He didn't need to, because for him, proof was enough. And Brooke saw in the slight tilt of his head, in the way he signaled, a decision preparing to be carried out in the same method she'd seen at the warehouse. Clean, efficient, disappearing. She stepped forward immediately, put herself between Declan and the man, like standing between night and a child. Said no, said not here, not in front of the parents, not on the first day they'd finally dared to trust. Declan looked at her like she was pressing her hand into a blade, his voice low as he said this man had come to send a message, and a message had to be answered, or tomorrow something else would burn. Brooke answered that if he responded with violence, the parents wouldn't separate who lit the fire and who punished it. They'd only see this center stained with blood, they'd pull their kids out, and then the saboteur would win without even needing to kill anyone. Declan stepped closer, his eyes cold, asked her if she thought he could build a place like this with words. Brooke lifted her chin and said he could build with money, with power, but trust was built only by not making people afraid, and if he wanted this soft layer of protection to survive, he had to learn not to soak it in his own darkness. They stood facing each other in the wash of the arriving fire truck lights, the siren tearing their words into pieces, and Brooke felt the crack between them open like a fracture line in glass, not because they didn't share the same goal, but because they believed in two different ways to survive. Declan finally signaled for the man to be released to the police, but the look in his eyes as he turned away said he wasn't forgiving. He was delaying, and Brooke watched him go, understanding that from this moment on, the community center wasn't only a project, it was a battlefield, and the fracture between her and Declan would be where someone else would try to slip in. After the blackout, the neighborhood didn't shout, didn't protest, didn't pound on doors demanding answers. They did something more frightening than all of that. They went quiet. The kind of quiet people learn when they understand that speaking up means being noticed. That safety sometimes is nothing more than lowering your head and slipping out of the line of sight. In the days that followed, the center gate still stood open. Class schedules still hung on the board. Basketballs still sat in the rack. Books still lined up neatly on the shelves, but there were more empty chairs than laughter. Parents walked past, looked in, then turned their faces away. Children were pulled along by the hand, hurried, as if someone's gaze might reach out and grab them. Brooke stood in the activity room, staring at the freshly painted wall, and felt like she was watching something fade right in front of her. The good things she'd fought to hold together, dying not for lack of money, but from fear. And fear always won in the cleanest way. It didn't need to break anything else. It only needed to keep people from coming back. She called a few mothers who'd promised they'd bring their kids. They answered, went silent for a long beat, then spoke in small voices that they couldn't, that they'd heard people talking, that they didn't want trouble, every sentence ending with an apology, as if they were apologizing for wanting to live quietly. And Brooke couldn't even be angry. She only felt a piece of her chest go hollow. She tried to work harder to make up for it, mopping floors, stacking chairs, retaping posters, setting out snacks as if care could pull people back, but those small tasks couldn't stand against the larger truth. Right as Brooke was standing alone in the center's small kitchen, her phone vibrated, the hospital, and the nurse's voice this time didn't circle around it. She said June Ashford's condition was worsening. She needed additional tests and a new kind of intervention, but the insurance wasn't enough. The hospital needed payment confirmation, or a transfer. Brooke felt her head start to ring. She asked how much, and the voice read out the number like a code. Brooke couldn't even hold on to the digits. She only held on to the feeling of free fall, because she'd just escaped the creditor, just escaped the silent calls, and still she was dragged back to the same old cliff, money and time. She called the hospital finance office, got transferred, got put on hold, listened to the hold music like funeral music. And when someone finally picked up, they talked about procedure, deposits, deadlines, polite in a way that was cruel, as if human hearts weren't an item in the catalog. Brooke left the center and sat on a bench outside, hands shaking, watching traffic pass as if everyone else lived in a different dimension where breathing was easy. A text came in from an unsaved number, not a threat, a proposal, saying they could handle the hospital costs immediately if Brooke was willing to meet someone at a hotel near the river tonight. Just talk, just sign one thing. Everything would be fine. Brooke knew that trap. She'd seen it in the faces of creditors, in the smiling suits at the hospital, in the neighborhood's silence. It was the kind of trap that didn't need a gun. It only needed someone who was desperate. She meant to delete it. Then she looked at her mother's photo on her phone, a face thinner month by month, eyes still trying to smile so Brooke wouldn't be afraid, and Brooke felt herself about to break at exactly her weakest point. That night she went to the hotel like someone walking into cold water, each step heavy, one question repeating in her head. If she sold a piece of her life to save her mother, was that what a daughter was supposed to do? And the moment she stepped into the lobby, a man approached, well-dressed, said her name, said they only needed her signature for a cooperation agreement, and his eyes didn't look at her like a person. They looked at her like a door. Brooke went still for one beat, then heard behind her the soft tap of shoes on stone, not rushed but heavy with purpose, like a straight line cutting through everything. Declan appeared right beside her. He didn't put his arms around her, didn't pull her close. He only set his hand on the back of a nearby chair like a cold claim, and his gaze hit the man hard enough that the smile on the man's face froze. "She isn't signing anything," Declan said, his voice low, not raised, but the whole lobby seemed to step back anyway. The man forced a laugh and said this was only financial assistance. Only an opportunity. Declan didn't argue. He signaled, and two other men appeared from near the entrance, silent, simply taking positions that made every path the man could take feel narrower. Brooke looked at Declan, wanted to ask if he'd been following her, wanted to scream that she wasn't a hostage, but the words caught because she saw in his eyes something that wasn't tenderness. It was a ruthless understanding that she'd been pushed to the edge. Declan didn't say "I love you," didn't say "don't be afraid." He only turned to the front desk clerk, said a few short lines with a name and a phone number, and within minutes Brooke's phone vibrated, the hospital calling back. Their tone clearly changed, saying someone had guaranteed the deposit, the treatment plan would move forward, and she only needed to come sign family consent paperwork. Brooke stood there, eyes burning, not from happiness, but because she understood she'd just escaped one kind of sale, only to have her debt shift into a different shape, owed now to a man she didn't want to depend on. Declan looked at her, his eyes not soft, and said one sentence like a nail driven into wood, that if she wanted to save her mother, she had to learn to tell the difference between someone reaching to pull her up and someone reaching to drag her down. And then he pulled her out of the hotel lobby with a motion that was rough but protective, like dragging someone back from a ledge before they could take one more step. After the hotel night, Brooke wasn't naive enough to believe that if she simply lived quietly, everything would settle on its own, because in the moment she'd almost signed, she'd seen that the trap wasn't in the paper, it was in her desperation, and she understood that if she kept getting pushed around like something light, the next time no one would pull her back in time. Her mother was admitted into the treatment protocol. The hospital stopped using that mechanical tone to press her down, but the relief didn't turn into peace. It turned into a sharp kind of awareness, as if every calm breath had been paid for by someone. Somehow, Brooke went back to the community center with a new purpose, not only to rebuild trust with posters and smiles, but to find out who was chiseling at the walls from the inside, because the person who'd cut the power last time knew far too well which wires to cut and what hour to strike. That didn't come from luck. It came from information. She started with the smallest things, the way a poor person learns to survive by details. She asked for access to the internal cameras, under the pretense of checking security after the incident. She sat in the monitoring room at the end of the day, the pale blue glow of the screens washing over her face, and she rewound and replayed footage no one wanted to watch. Which doors opened when, who used the side entrance, who lingered too long near the electrical panel, who vanished at the exact moment the lights went out. She compared it to the staffing schedule, the personnel list, the class start times, and she began to see a careful pattern. Every time there was a crowded activity, there was always a 10-minute window beforehand when someone would loop through the service hallway, as if by accident, and that person was often the new volunteer, the one who'd arrived too perfectly on time. Brooke didn't rush to a conclusion. She forced herself to stay cold-headed, because a wrong conclusion in this world could kill someone. She kept watching his habits, how he casually asked about staff shifts, how he happened to stand beside the notice board longer than he needed to, how he could tell smooth stories about community work, but his eyes always slid over the cameras before they slid over the children. Brooke searched his name in the volunteer file. Paperwork legitimate, phone number, address, everything so clean it felt suspicious, the kind of clean you get when someone who knows procedure wipes something down. She tried a different route and asked people who'd worked in the area a long time if they'd ever seen him before. Most shook their heads. One person said the name sounded familiar but couldn't place the face, and that haze of uncertainty made Brooke feel the hair on her skin rise. She began to track him through small moves, planted a fake sheet about a meeting schedule in a place only internal staff would see, then checked the cameras to see who photographed it. She changed the opening time in a casual, staged conversation and watched whether that information leaked outside. And a few days later, a strange car appeared at exactly that fake hour, parked on the corner like it had been given the schedule. Brooke didn't need more proof to know there was an information line. She only needed to know where it led. One afternoon, while the volunteer stood outside taking a phone call, Brooke walked past and caught a few broken words. Not enough to accuse him, but enough for her to recognize the name of a local political office, the same one she'd seen on a flyer for a fundraiser at a Loop hotel, the place where people talked about community in voices slick as oil. Brooke didn't confront him, and she didn't call Declan, because she'd seen how Declan cleaned up, and she knew that if she spoke too soon, the man would vanish along with the evidence, like the man at the warehouse, and then she'd be left with nothing but intuition, and intuition didn't beat systems. She chose to play chess in a way Declan might hate but the system would fear. She photographed the camera screen with her phone, logged hours, logged dates, logged the license plate of the strange car, logged every time the volunteer entered the service hallway. She made a duplicate of the data and hid it in two places. One she kept, one she sent to a new email, unconnected to any of her accounts, like she was preparing for the day she'd be stripped of everything. She began to act more normal around the volunteer, even friendlier, so he wouldn't get suspicious, while inside her, every feeling was compressed into a single cold line, and for the first time since she'd stepped into that alley, Brooke wasn't the one being dragged by invisible forces. She was pulling back, little by little, with evidence, with patience, with learning the rules of the machines she was trapped between, so that one day, when Declan wanted to solve it with violence, she could place on the table the only thing that made violence unnecessary: truth signed by time and camera. Brooke thought she was getting closer to the truth when the game shifted, as if someone behind the chessboard decided there was no need to wait for her to gather proof. It was enough to break her. And that break came on an afternoon when she left the hospital after signing the family paperwork, walking through the multi-level parking structure because she didn't want one of Declan's cars picking her up too openly. Wind off the lake cut through, cold and sharp, and Brooke felt a familiar sensation like the alley night, the feeling of being watched from behind before she even turned. A man stood near the payment machine, wearing a baseball cap, a phone in his hand, ordinary at a glance. But when their eyes met, Brooke saw the emptiness in his gaze, the emptiness of someone working on orders. No curiosity, no emotion, only a target. She moved faster, not running, because running told the world she was afraid, but behind her footsteps picked up, no longer pretending. And Brooke understood the second hunt had begun, this time not to kill Declan in the dark, but to drag him into the light by placing her on the hook. She burst out of the garage, crossed the street, slipped into a stretch of warehouses near the docks, where oil and river water mixed into a damp metallic stink. Distant train horns like a late warning, and stacked containers formed narrow corridors that let a hunter close in. Brooke carried nothing but her phone and a small bag, but she had something else, a map in her head. She'd learned to read exits, blind angles, cameras, side doors, from the days she'd been digging through the center's footage, and from the night she'd saved Declan. A dry sound snapped behind her, not loud, but enough for her to know there was a gun. Brooke didn't look back. She only cut hard, slid through a puddle of black water, nearly went down, then grabbed the edge of a container to keep her balance. The phone in her hand vibrated, an unknown number. Brooke didn't answer, but a short message flashed on the screen like a blade. Run fast. Let Declan see, and in that instant Brooke understood they didn't need to shoot her right away. They wanted her alive long enough to panic and call for help, to pull Declan out. She forced herself not to call, because calling was losing. But an old truck ahead suddenly roared to life as if someone had been waiting, blocking the exit, and Brooke realized this wasn't one man following by chance. This was a formation, someone cutting her off in front, someone pressing from behind, someone stationed at the corner to force her into the dead path. She turned into an industrial strip, where factories shut early, the road empty, dirty yellow sodium light spilling over concrete like wastewater, and the footsteps behind her stayed tighter, unhurried, unpanicked, like hunting animals that knew the prey was tiring. Brooke ran over a low fence, her coat snagged on the wire, tearing open. She didn't stop. She yanked hard, skin burning, but it didn't hurt as much as the thought of her mother lying in that hospital bed and Brooke vanishing before she got to look at her one more time. A gunshot cracked. The bullet punched metal beside her, sparks flaring. Brooke dropped behind a wall, breathing hard, and for the first time she saw clearly what they were willing to do if they had to. Then another engine sound tore in, fast and heavy, like a larger beast charging a pack of smaller ones. A black car appeared from the corner. No siren, no lights, only driving straight into the space between Brooke and the men tailing her, forcing them to split. The door flew open. One of Declan's men grabbed Brooke and hauled her inside with a clean, forceful motion. No questions, no permission, like pulling an object out of a firing line, and before Brooke could catch her breath, she heard Declan's voice up front, low, short, issuing commands like pressing buttons. The car cut hard, slid past a warehouse gate half-locked, stopped in a hidden yard behind an abandoned factory. And the moment the hunters rushed in, Declan stepped out. Brooke didn't even see when he'd gotten there. She only saw him standing under that dirty yellow light, dark coat, spine straight, like a cut in the air, and the men slowed for a beat, because even assassins knew when prey had turned into hunter. Declan didn't fire wildly. He didn't shout. He moved fast and precise. A blink and a gun was stripped away. A short strike to a wrist, a kick to a knee, a chokehold tightened just enough to drop someone without killing. Controlled violence like surgery, clean and cold. Brooke sat in the car looking through the glass and saw blood didn't spray into spectacle. It only soaked into fabric and concrete like a reminder that real power didn't need performance. It only needed results. One man tried to raise his gun toward Brooke through the window. Declan turned, twisted the barrel away, drove the butt into the man's temple, and the man collapsed like a shadow with the lights cut, No scream, only a heavy thud. When it ended, Declan came back to the car, opened the door, looked at Brooke, his eyes not asking if she was okay, only checking she was breathing and intact. Then he said one short line, that they had changed targets, that she was bait, and that she'd just proven it. Brooke wanted to answer with anger, but her throat tightened because she'd just seen how dangerous he was. A kind of danger that wasn't loud but could still erase people from a life. On the ride back, Brooke's phone kept vibrating with police alerts about an incident tied to her. And when they stopped at a safe location, one of Declan's men handed Brooke a copy of a temporary evidence intake report the lawyer had just obtained through a source inside the department. Brooke read it and her hands went cold, because listed among the evidence in a newly opened case, her Zippo was recorded as seized from a scene connected to violence and witness intimidation, with notes about fingerprints and possible linkage to an altercation. Brooke stared at that line and understood the final piece of the nightmare. Someone had used her Zippo not only to track her, but to build a legal trap, turning her father's keepsake into a noose around her neck. So when they needed it, they only had to pull, silencing her with procedure, with accusations, with the false cleanliness of paperwork. And Declan stood beside her, silent. But Brooke knew that from this moment on, the war wasn't in an alley or at the docks anymore. It had climbed onto the desks of people who knew how to use the law like a knife. After the chase at the docks, Declan didn't take Brooke back to the secured apartment right away. He brought her somewhere more sealed, a small warehouse converted into a temporary office, so clean it felt cold. Nothing extra beyond a metal table, a chair, a computer, and white light that didn't allow darkness to hide anything. Brooke was still shaking with fear and anger, but that shaking didn't soften her, it sharpened her. And when she saw the man tied to the chair across from her, his mouth not taped, his face bruised, his eyes lowered, Brooke knew this wasn't one of the assassins from the docks. This was the one who'd opened the door from the inside, the one who'd sold schedules, the one who'd turned a community project into a battlefield, and maybe the one who'd pushed her Zippo into a dirty case file. Declan stood behind her, silent like a wall, 2 bodyguards at the door. And Brooke could feel in the air the familiar shape of a sentence about to be carried out. Efficient, quiet, the way it had been in the warehouse that night. She stepped forward before Declan could signal, put her hand on the table edge, looked Declan straight in the eyes and said no. Said this time no one disappeared. This time he had to live. Declan narrowed his eyes, his voice low and cold, asked Brooke where she thought she was. Brooke answered that she was in the place he wanted to win, not just survive. And if he killed the man, he would only win one fight on the street, while the system would win the whole war with paperwork and handshakes. Declan watched her for a long moment, as if weighing whether she had the nerve to say that to his face. Then he gave a small nod and signaled to step back, not fully agreeing, only delaying the ending he was used to. Brooke turned to the insider, her voice not gentle and not shouting. She asked one question. Who paid? Who ordered it? And why? The man stayed silent at first, only breathing hard, then looked up at Declan as if begging for a death faster than the truth. But Brooke didn't let him hide. She set the copied evidence intake report about the Zippo on the table and said they had turned a keepsake into a noose. And if he didn't talk, she'd let Declan do it his way. In this room, Declan's name was like a blade held to skin. The insider swallowed. His lips trembled. And finally, he said he had no choice. He said he was in debt, not small debt. Debt you didn't escape by taking extra shifts. He said he'd borrowed to save his family, to keep his house, to pay for treatment for a relative, and then a political office appeared like a savior, promising to clear the debt, promising protection, in exchange for only a few pieces of information, a few schedules, a few times opening a door at the right moment. He said at first it was only giving the hour Declan left the lounge. Then it became routes. Then it became transferring a data package. And when he realized he'd sold more than a schedule, when he heard about the ledger and the public land project, he'd wanted to stop, but that politician had him by the throat with the most effective weapon, debt and family. He said they knew his mother's address, his child's school, the hour his wife went to work, and every time he hesitated, they reminded him that one phone call was all it took for everything he loved to vanish from his life the way people vanished in this city. Brooke listened and felt her stomach tighten, not out of pity, but because she understood that mechanism. It was the same mechanism that had dragged her to the edge at the hotel. Only he had fallen. She asked for the politician's name. The insider shook harder. His eyes flicked to Declan, and Declan stood there like a door that didn't open, making it clear that speaking could mean life, and silence would certainly mean death. The insider finally said it, the name dropping out of his mouth like a stone, and Brooke fixed it in her mind, then asked where the proof was, the messages, the calls, the middlemen, who took the money. He said there was a second phone, there were emails, there were meetings, there was a contact from that office, and there was a habit. They always met at a cafe near City Hall, and they always used the same greeting line to confirm. Brooke looked at Declan and said, confession wasn't enough. They needed living evidence, something that could stand up under light. So they had to keep him alive long enough to hand everything over and cooperate. Declan gave a thin laugh, not joy, only an exhale, and said keeping a traitor alive was risk. It was dirtying their hands a different way. Brooke answered that their hands were already dirty. The question was whether they wanted to wash them with water or with blood, and if they wanted to beat the system, they had to use what the system feared most, evidence that followed procedure. Brooke turned back to the insider and laid down a condition with no softness, that she wouldn't force him to kill himself or use him as bait. But he had to cooperate fully, and in return, his family had to be protected. Not an empty promise. Real protection, a safe place, new numbers, new routes, because if they didn't protect them, he'd clamp up from fear. Declan reacted immediately, his eyes darkening, his voice saying that wasn't his problem. Brooke held his gaze and said that if he wanted the man to tell the whole truth, he had to give him a reason to believe that speaking wouldn't get his family killed, and this was the only path to winning that wasn't just winning on the street. The air in the room tightened like a wire. Then Declan turned away for a beat, his jaw set, and finally he nodded, not because he liked it, but because he recognized Brooke was right. And in that nod, Brooke saw a rare concession, not out of feeling, but out of strategy, because for the first time, they were trying to strike a suited enemy with the one thing suits couldn't tolerate: truth, with a witness still breathing. Declan didn't like courtrooms, didn't like incident reports, didn't like any place where his power had to stand in line behind stamps and signatures. But after the insider's confession, he stood still in front of a reality even he couldn't punch apart, that if they wanted to bring down a politician, they couldn't do it the way they brought down an enemy on the street, because on the street, people feared guns. But inside the system, people feared admissible evidence. An independent attorney was brought in, not Declan's, not tied to any of the familiar offices around him. A woman with neatly cut hair, sharp eyes, a voice so calm it felt cold, the kind of person who'd watched too many powerful men cry when the camera light came on. Brooke sat across from her in a small conference room. Declan stood against the wall like a shadow that refused to sit, and Brooke could see the conflict in him. He wanted to crush the problem now, but he was forcing himself into terrain where law was the weapon. The attorney said they needed 3 things: a clear recorded chain of communications, a sting transaction that could prove intent to bribe and intimidate a witness, and a trail for the ledger that was strong enough to force the other side to show their face, because people in power didn't move unless they saw a reward. The insider would be kept alive in a sealed location, communicating through equipment the attorney provided to prevent accusations of fabrication. Every call recorded according to procedure, every message backed up with timestamps, and every meeting documented with a witness or lawful camera. Not street-style hidden footage, but the kind that could stand in public. Brooke offered the data she'd collected at the center: staffing schedules, license plates, camera clips of the volunteer entering the service hallway. And the attorney looked at those numbers the way you look at veins, said this was the spine that would connect the story, and the flesh would be a trap that made the politician put a signature on his own crime. Declan's face went hard at that, because he knew a trap meant bait. It meant letting the other side believe they were winning. And Brooke understood immediately who the bait was. Not Declan, because Declan was mud everyone already knew. It was her, a witness who looked clean on paper, a poor woman working night shifts, a mother in a hospital bed, a record with no stains, someone who, if threatened, bribed, framed, would make the perfect story for anyone trying to crush a witness's voice. The attorney said it plainly. Brooke had to be the one to take the call, had to be the one to show up for the fake deal, because the politician wouldn't expose himself in front of Declan, but he would feel confident in front of a woman he believed he could grind down with law and money. Brooke heard it and felt her stomach tighten, the hotel memory rising again, that sensation of almost signing to save her mother, and she understood they were asking her to walk up to that same ledge one more time, The only difference was that this time she'd be walking with a plan. Declan objected immediately, his voice low but burning, saying she wasn't bait. Brooke looked at him and said she'd been bait since the moment her Zippo was turned into dirty evidence. The only difference now was that she could choose how she was used, and she chose a way that made someone else fall. The tension between them shifted from survival into something harder. Trust. Something you couldn't force with orders, couldn't buy with money, and couldn't build with soft words. Declan stepped closer. Didn't touch her, but close enough that Brooke felt a rare warmth from his body. He asked if she was sure, and Brooke said she wasn't sure. She just didn't have another choice if she wanted her mother to live without being pulled under again, if she wanted the community center not to die of fear, if she wanted her father's Zippo not to become a noose around her neck. The attorney laid out the plan like laying rails. The insider would call back the politician's contact and say Brooke was wavering, that she wanted to meet to negotiate, that she had something that could cause trouble for them, and they needed to clean it up before it became a bigger problem. While at the same time, a false trail of the ledger would be released, a controlled leak saying Declan was losing control of the data, that a copy could land in the hands of the press, and the only person who could stop it was the politician. Everything had to happen within a specific time window, at a location with lawful cameras and witnesses, a private room in a Loop hotel where a fundraiser had been held before, so the story would come full circle, and so the other side would feel confident, because it was their turf. Declan had to step out of his familiar darkness, had to accept the attorney as the one keeping tempo, had to accept Brooke as the center of the performance, and it made him uncomfortable, the way being tied up made a man uncomfortable. Brooke saw that, and even though she still feared him, still hated the violence in him, she began to notice another fracture, the fracture of a man who wasn't used to placing his life in someone else's hands, now having to place it in the hands of a poor woman he'd once called a risk. When everyone left the conference room, only Brooke and Declan remained, the white overhead lights making everything raw. Brooke said she would do it, but she needed a promise. Not a promise of love, a promise that he wouldn't kill the insider before they gathered enough evidence, and that he wouldn't turn this plan into a bloodbath if the rhythm slipped. Declan looked at her for a long time, his eyes dark and deep. Then he nodded, slow, like signing an invisible clause, and in that moment Brooke felt that the most dangerous closeness didn't come from touch. It came from the fact that two people were learning how to trust each other inside a game, where one wrong beat meant blood would pay the price. The Loop Hotel shone like a dream paid for with someone else's money. A wide lobby, polished stone, chandeliers hanging like an artificial sky, and the scent of expensive perfume laying over the air like mist that made Brooke feel as if she were walking into a world her lungs didn't belong to. She wore a simple dress the attorney's people had chosen, not glittering enough to draw the wrong kind of attention, not cheap enough to be dismissed at the door. Her hair tied neatly back, her wrist hiding a tiny recording device under the fabric like a second heartbeat. Declan walked beside her, a fitted dark suit, his posture straight as a cut line. But he didn't touch her, didn't place a hand at her back, didn't take her hand. He only stayed close enough that anyone looking would understand she hadn't come alone, and that untouching distance was more dangerous than any gesture, because it said he didn't need to own her publicly for the entire room to still account for him. Brooke moved through people in tuxedos and evening gowns, hearing soft laughter, the clink of glasses, the slick, oil-smooth compliments, and she realized that here, a handshake at the right moment could kill more effectively than a gun, because it opened doors to land projects, to contracts, to a signature that pushed an entire neighborhood out of their homes while no one called it violence. She saw faces from campaign posters, donors, other attorneys, people who looked at Declan with a mix of fear and practiced ignorance, because everyone knew, and everyone needed to play clean. Their independent attorney stood at the edge of the room like a legal shadow. Another woman on the security team played the role of event assistant, and Brooke knew everyone was in position, like a stage where one wrong step meant falling. Brooke was guided into the cocktail area, where the jazz was soft but the rhythm underneath was hunting rhythm. She smiled the right amount, answered harmless questions about the community center, talked about children, about classes, about hope, and each time she spoke a true sentence, she felt strange because that truth was being used as bait. When she had the opening, Brooke drifted past the sponsor registration table, where tablets and access badges were laid out so guests could check in and receive project information. She bent as if picking up a fallen paper, her fingers quickly touching the small device the attorney's team had prepared, plugging it into the port for a brief beat, long enough to copy access permissions and the organizer's contact schedule, then pulling it away as if she'd never done anything. She felt cold sweat soak her back, but her face stayed still. Because here, you didn't get caught for trembling. You got caught for showing. Declan was across the room, his eyes never leaving her, but he didn't step toward her. He let her stand alone in the circle of light like a final test. And Brooke hated that feeling, hated having to be strong alone, but she understood that if he shielded her, they wouldn't bite. The local politician appeared right on time, as if someone had fed him the hour. He moved into the crowd with a thick smile and a warm voice, shaking hands like he was handing out candy. And when he saw Brooke, his smile didn't disappear. It only changed angle, turning sharper. Brooke Ashford. He said her name clearly, right there in the middle of the lobby, like he was introducing a speaker. And in that moment, Brooke felt the eyes around her shift, not because she mattered, but because a sudden name always carried the scent of scandal. Brooke held her smile, answered politely, said she only helped the center, and he stepped closer, speaking low enough that only she could hear, yet still inside the lit zone where the event cameras could catch mouth movements, that he admired her kindness, that he'd heard what she'd been through, and what a coincidence that her mother was in the hospital, a hospital with so many procedures that could change with a single call to the right person. Brooke felt her throat go dry, because this wasn't a threat in darkness anymore, it was a threat in light. The kind of threat where if she reacted wrong, the room would only see a poor girl losing her temper while he remained the courteous man. He went on, telling her she should be careful with people like Declan, that men like that pulled anyone close only to cover themselves, and if she wanted a quiet life, she only had to do something simple. Stop, stay silent, sign a statement saying she'd been mistaken, that she wasn't sure what had happened in the alley, that her Zippo was evidence she'd caused trouble, and in exchange her mother would be taken care of, the center wouldn't be pressured. She would be left alone. Brooke heard every word like metal against teeth, and she knew the trap had snapped shut. He was asking her to lock her own mouth with the system itself, to make herself a legal liar. She glanced toward Declan and saw him standing a few meters away, not touching, not moving, but his eyes had gone darker, like an animal forced to sit in a cage and wait for prey to expose itself. Brooke felt her heartbeat hammer beneath the hidden device, her hand wanting to tremble, but she remembered her mother, remembered the empty chairs at the center, remembered her father's Zippo turned into a noose, and she understood this was the moment to choose. Either run to protect a false peace, or play it through to reclaim the right to tell the truth. Brooke drew in a slow breath, kept her smile, and right there under the lights of power, she decided she wouldn't bow, even if the price was a phone call to the hospital before the night was over. That same night, the politician didn't need to leave the lobby to strike. He only needed one call to the right place. And Brooke knew it the moment her phone vibrated in her pocket, like a heartbeat being squeezed, the hospital number flashing. The voice on the other end, still polite but cold, saying there had been a change in coverage, that the payment file had just been flagged for verification, that some services were temporarily delayed until things were clarified, and those words clamped down on Brooke's lungs right in the middle of a room full of champagne. She stood in the hotel's women's restroom, white lights bleaching her reflection, her hand gripping the sink like it was the last solid thing left, and she could hear her own blood pounding in her ears, because she understood this tactic didn't need violence. It only needed to turn time into an enemy, to make every delayed hour a cut. She called the hospital's financial office back, got transferred, got put on hold, and while she waited, a message from an unknown number slid onto her screen, saying they only wanted things quiet, saying she only needed to sign, and her mother's treatment would continue as if nothing had happened. Brooke broke in one tiny moment, not with tears, but with exhaustion, the kind of exhaustion of someone who'd been running her whole life and still got dragged back to the starting line. She imagined walking out, leaving the hotel, leaving the plan, leaving everything, just to hold on to her mother. And then she remembered the way he'd said her name out loud in front of everyone, the way he'd led her like an animal by the leash of paperwork, and Brooke realized that if she signed, she wouldn't be saving her mother. She'd be trading her mother for a lifetime of silence, and next time, they could still tighten the grip. Brooke went back into the reception, her face calmer than what was happening inside her. She walked straight to the independent attorney and spoke quietly, said the hospital was being squeezed, said the other side had started choking her with procedure. The attorney watched her for a beat, then nodded and said that meant they had more evidence of pressure and intimidation. Brooke only had to keep her head cold one more time. Declan came closer, didn't touch her, but stood near enough that Brooke felt him like a wall. And when Brooke told him about the hospital, she saw his eyes darken, his jaw lock, part of him wanting to smash it open immediately. But he didn't. He looked at Brooke like he was asking if she was backing out. Brooke swallowed hard and said she wasn't backing out. She would stay and be bait one last time, because if she backed out now, everything she'd endured, every fear in that neighborhood, her father's Zippo, and her mother's whole life would become nothing but tools for a man in a suit. Declan went quiet for a long beat. Then he nodded. Not softly, but like signing a new debt. And Brooke understood he'd accepted the thing he hated most, fighting in the light. The plan shifted instantly. The attorney signaled her team to clear the way. A meeting was set in the hotel's private section under the pretense that Brooke wanted to negotiate. The recording devices and lawful cameras were activated according to protocol, and Brooke walked into the room the way you walk into an operating room, knowing she would hurt but refusing to tremble. The politician arrived wearing that thick smile. With an assistant at his side, he began by asking about Brooke's mother the way someone asked about the weather, then slid straight into urging her to sign a statement of misunderstanding, lacing it with vague remarks about how her file could become uncomfortable if she didn't cooperate. Brooke kept her voice steady and asked what he wanted from the community center, what he wanted from the land project, what he wanted from the ledger. And that question darkened his eyes, because it touched something he believed only existed in shadow. He denied it, smiled, then talked about Declan as a dangerous man, talked about Brooke as a pawn. And while he spoke, Brooke saw the assistant's hand sending a quick text beneath the table, a tiny movement, but enough for Brooke to know the killers were being pulled in on schedule. That was the moment Declan moved in a new way, not with a gun, but with a cutting move. He didn't enter the room, but out in the hallway his people had already sealed every approach in a tight control ring. No noise. Just different guards, different access badges, different camera angles, and more than that, he released a false piece of information that the ledger would be handed to an investigative journalist within the hour. And the traitor inside the politician's camp couldn't stand it, exposed himself trying to claim the prize, sent the wrong signal, and the moment that signal was caught, the net closed. Right when the politician believed he was pushing Brooke to the edge, the controlled leak went live. A copy of part of the ledger and the recorded calls, messages, and time-stamped proof from the sting began moving through channels the attorney had prepared. Not blasted everywhere, but delivered to the right places where the truth could be kept alive. The politician blinked, his smile slipping out of alignment. He understood someone had pulled back the curtain, and in that instant Brooke saw his power stop looking smooth and start showing teeth. Outside the room, a group of unfamiliar men tried to approach and got turned back. No gunshots, only footsteps stopping and hands losing their phones, and Brooke understood Declan had cut off the assassins, without turning the hotel into a battlefield, because he was keeping his promise to her in the only way he knew how, paying a real price to hold the rhythm. When Brooke left the room, her legs felt soft as sponge, but she stayed upright, and Declan stepped close. This time he didn't say much. He only looked at her like he was confirming she was still intact. Then he said quietly that the hospital wouldn't be touched again. Brooke wanted to ask how, but she saw something rare in his eyes. The fatigue of a man who'd just accepted stepping into the light to be pelted with stones, only to keep a promise to a woman he'd once believed was nothing but a risk. And Brooke understood a hard truth, that Declan could be ruthless to his enemies until he became darkness. But with her, he was learning how to be ruthless to himself by dragging his empire under the lights, in exchange for one real chance for her and her mother to live without having to bow. City Hall that morning looked bright in a cold way. White stone, tall columns, the flag hanging still as if it was holding its breath. And beyond the metal barricades, a mixed crowd pressed together. Reporters, neighborhood residents, the curious, and the ones who'd come to watch a power play collapse like theater. Brooke climbed the steps, feeling as if she was carrying her whole life on her shoulders. No thin coat from the alley night, no delivery bag, only simple clothes and eyes that had been through too much to be afraid of noise anymore. Declan stood a few steps behind her, not touching, not shielding, but his presence felt like a dark cloud hovering behind the camera lights, reminding everyone this story wasn't only about a poor girl, it was a crack running through the city. The hearing was called to clarify the public land project and the related allegations, But everyone understood this was where they'd test whether truth could stand upright in front of power. When Brooke was invited to speak, she saw the microphone, the rows of cameras, the eyes waiting for her to stumble. And in that moment, she thought of her mother on a hospital bed, thought of the community center with its empty chairs, thought of footsteps in the alley and her father's Zippo turned into a noose. And then she began. She didn't perform. She didn't rise into grand speeches. She only told it in the voice of someone who'd lived in fear so long that fear had become a schedule. She spoke of the land that was called a project for the community, but was really an excuse to push poor people somewhere else. She spoke of the invisible violence of power, the kind that didn't need a gun, only a file, a procedure, a phone call to a hospital, a mark on paperwork, and a mother breathing weakly was enough to force a daughter to sign herself into silence. She said violence didn't always spill blood out on the street. There was violence that made people too afraid to bring their children to a center because they didn't want to be noticed. Violence that made people choose silence just to be left alone, and it was that silence that fattened evil. The crowd started with whispers, then went quiet, because everyone there had seen the system grind people down. They just rarely heard it named that directly. When it came time for evidence, the independent attorney stepped forward and presented the chain of recordings, messages, the timestamps of the Sting transaction, and especially the documents linking the land project's money flow to shell companies, page by page like peeling the hide off a beast. The politician sitting in the front row tried to hold his smile, tried to say it was a fabrication from the underworld, that Brooke was being manipulated, and right then the thing that changed the room's air wasn't Declan, it was a police investigator standing up off to the side. The one who'd followed the case from the beginning, the one who'd once looked at Brooke in a way that made her feel like a criminal. He stepped forward, didn't look at Brooke, looked straight at the counsel, and said there had been interference with the evidence file, that Brooke's Zippo had been misrouted, assigned the wrong code, pushed into a different violence case to create grounds to accuse her and silence a witness, and he produced the internal log chain along with confirmation from the audit unit, evidence so clean no one could argue with it. Brooke heard that and felt as if her chest had been torn open and stitched back together, because her father's keepsake was finally being called by its real name. Not a weapon, not tainted evidence, but something that had been exploited. The politician sprang to his feet, reacting with the instinct of a man being stripped of his mask, trying to drag the story back to Declan, trying to say it was all a Mafia game, that the city couldn't trust a man like him. And in his panic, he made the mistake. He said a detail only someone inside the chain would know, about the ledger and how it was kept. A short slip of the tongue, but enough to tighten the rope around his own neck. The attorney seized it immediately. The police investigator turned and asked how he knew that. And the politician froze, his eyes shifting, then tried to patch it by blaming subordinates. But it was too late, because the lawful evidence was already on the table, and his words had just confessed a connection. When the hearing paused, the City Hall hallway became the place where everything ended as fast as a button press. The investigator and a group of federal agents appeared, cuffed the politician in front of the cameras. No struggle, only rights read aloud and a body guided away, and camera flashes cracked like dry thunder. The crowd roared, then fell silent again. The kind of silence you get when you've just seen something you didn't believe could happen. But in the same moment Brooke thought she'd won. She heard Declan's name spoken in the same sentence. Because when the lights are turned on, they don't only shine on the man in the suit, they also shine on the man who's lived in the dark. An official read that Declan Voss remained a subject in multiple older investigations, that this cooperation didn't erase the past, that one good act couldn't wash away years of blood and dirty money. And Declan stood there, his face unchanged. But Brooke saw something heavy as stone at the bottom of his eyes. The truth that he'd accepted fighting in the light, and now the light was calling his name, the way it called a sin that wasn't easy to bury. Brooke turned to look at him through the noise and the flashing lights, and she understood the real victory wasn't a pair of handcuffs in a hallway. It was the confrontation that came next, where both of them would have to pay for the truth, in a way no one would be allowed to pretend was clean anymore. After the hearing at City Hall, the city didn't suddenly become kind. It only changed the way it bit people, quieter and harder to spot. But Brooke could feel one real shift. For the first time in weeks, she wasn't being chased by blind fear. The fear now had a shape, a name, a file, and someone who could be held responsible. Declan entered the phase he hated most, sitting in an office with attorneys and investigators, reading every cooperation clause like a voluntary sentence, and he accepted that he'd have to sacrifice part of his own empire, not because he'd suddenly decided to become a good man, but because he understood the dirty circle only gets cut when someone powerful enough drags it into the light without being crushed immediately. He agreed to hand over the threads that were necessary to close the laundering routes, agreed to pull out of operations that kept whole neighborhoods squeezed and breathless, agreed to let doors that used to open through violence now close through law, in exchange for a witness protection agreement for Brooke and her mother. A long-term layer of safety that didn't depend on temporary fear, but on truth that had been formally recognized. Brooke didn't look at Declan like a hero. She looked at him like a man paying in his own way, hard and rough, but paying for real, and she understood that sometimes the only redemption a powerful person can offer is using that very power to block the dirty system that once fed them. Brooke's mother made it through the dangerous stretch. The hospital stopped making those steel-cold calls. The doctor's voice softened, and for the first time, Brooke let herself believe her mother would have more time to live, not because of some dirty bargain, but because no one could clamp down on a file anymore as leverage. The community center was rebuilt. The wiring was replaced. The security system was inspected again. Classes reopened on time. And then one afternoon, the empty chairs started to fill. Children ran in the way you run, into a place where you can breathe. Parents paused outside the door for a long beat, and then stepped through, their eyes still cautious, but no longer turning away as if the building itself was a curse. And Brooke saw that the good thing hadn't died. It had only been smothered for a while, and when people found enough courage to come back, it flared again, small but real. A day after that, Brooke was called in to retrieve the evidence. In an office full of paperwork and printer noise, a clerk set the Zippo on the table in an unsealed bag that had already been opened, and said it had been confirmed as misassigned, that it had been routed into the wrong case, and they apologized the way systems apologize, with little emotion and a lot of procedure. But Brooke didn't need them to tear up. She only needed the Zippo back in the right hands. She picked it up, the cold metal warming in her palm, and in that moment she felt as if her dignity had been returned along with her father's keepsake, the ownership of her own life no longer something someone else could turn into a noose. On the last night before things settled into something Brooke could finally call a beginning again, Declan stood beside a black car with the door open. He didn't say much. He only looked at her like he was asking whether she wanted to step into a world that was still dark but no longer lonely. And Brooke stood under the streetlight, remembering the alley, remembering the kicks, remembering being shoved to the edge because of her mother, remembering that Declan had kept his word even when it meant dragging his own past into the light. And she got into the car not out of fear, not because she was being pulled, but because she chose to. The city was still dim. It still had corners without light. It still had NDs that preferred control through fear. But this time Brooke knew she wasn't alone. And somehow, Declan wasn't alone either. But just as the car rolled forward, a message came in from the independent attorney, short and cold, saying one point in the chain of evidence still didn't fit. One name still hadn't fully shown its face, like a shadow standing behind the curtain, and Brooke understood the real traitor in the dark might still be breathing somewhere, only waiting for the right moment. This story leaves behind a lesson that's simple and hard to live. Kindness isn't free, but it isn't meaningless either. It can make you hunted, but it can also force an entire system to turn its face toward the truth. And sometimes real strength isn't not being afraid. It's standing there anyway while you're afraid, to protect what's right and to protect the people you love. If this story touched your emotions, please subscribe to our channel, like, and share to support us, and so you won't miss the exciting videos we upload every day. How do you feel about Brooke and Declan's story? And have you ever faced a moment in real life where you had to choose between staying silent to keep the peace or speaking up to live the truth? Please leave a comment. We truly want to hear what's in your heart. Hello, and see you again in the next video. Wishing everyone watching this video good health, a joyful life, and peaceful days. Goodbye and see you again in the next video.